Welcome to Mythseeker and Bigfoot Part 2. My name is Dr. Diane Hope. I'm a scientist and audio producer who's always been intrigued by the mysterious and the unexplained. In this series, I dig into the science, history and culture behind some of our most celebrated modern myths and unsolved mysteries. Where did they come from? And what, if any, truth is behind them? In part 1, we left off where anatomy and anthropology professor Jeff Meldrum had just received a shock about some of the footprint evidence for Bigfoot that he had assumed was authentic. On the 7th of November 2024, Meldrum sat down with the producers of the film Capturing Bigfoot to watch the footage they had found, which had been locked away in a safe for decades. Director Mark Evans said that the professor watched quietly, afterwards reportedly commenting off camera, "I don't know if I'm going to have a job after this." The next day, the film team went to Meldrum's office to record an interview with him after he'd had a chance to digest what he'd seen. Meldrum had been the one academic who'd been willing to stick his reputation on the line in terms of the '67 Patterson Gimlin film footage and Bigfoot in general. He clearly understood what the newly revealed footage meant, but he told the filmmakers that although the Patterson Gimlin film may now be debunked, it didn't change his opinion on the other footprint research he'd done. What was the other evidence that Professor Meldrum still put his faith in? In his interview with me made several years earlier, the professor first described the features of the casts of Bigfoot prints taken at the Patterson Gimlin film site and others from across the world, including tracks found by anthropologists on another continent a decade after the Patterson Gimlin film was taken.
In the plains of East Africa, Mary Leakey and her team discovered in exposed, eroding volcanic ash, there was a line of tracks, footprints of a hominin, presumably something like Australopithecus afarensis. I'm very interested in the anatomical details that are evident in the footprint. One of the distinguishing characteristics that sets it apart from the human foot generally is the presence of the mid-tarsal break. By break, we mean an axis of flexion. When walking on a rather plastic-yielding substrate like a sandbar, soft soil, or mud, occasionally that action of the foot flexing through the midfoot can cause a pressure ridge to be raised behind the forefoot. This is a very distinctive trait and one that is evident in some of the earliest examples of the Sasquatch footprints that had gone unnoticed, unidentified until I drew attention to it decades later.
So where else had Meldrum seen similar footprints?
In the 90s, I had the singular opportunity to travel to China to confer with some investigators and witnesses of the Chinese equivalent to the Sasquatch, which is referred to as the Yeren, which in Chinese translates to the wild man, literally, the wild man. One witness in particular had experienced a visual encounter with a creature. Mr. Yuan, who was a park ranger in the Shenanjia Nature Reserve, cast two footprints, a pair of footprints, beside a spring where it had apparently squatted, presumably to get a drink. I shared a reprint of a paper in which I had illustrations, 3D scans of a vivid example of the mid-tarsal pressure ridge. And upon seeing this figure, he became very excited. And sure enough, when he opened up his case and unwrapped the toweling from around this pair of casts, his tracks were dead ringers. They were a little wider, but the details of the anatomy were remarkably similar. Mr. Yuan could not speak English. He had no access to the English-speaking documentaries on cable TV or social media and such. He even asked me if there was anything like the wild man, the Yeren, in America. For me, it really stands as a testament to the credibility of this evidence.
On another trip closer to home, in the Blue Mountains of southeastern Washington, Jeff called in, unannounced, on a Forest Service worker named Paul Freeman, who spent his spare time driving the local dirt roads on the lookout for footprints in the talcum powder-like glacial deposits found in the surrounding forests.
He was impressed with the questions I was asking and my comments, and he said, well, you obviously know a lot about footprints. Would you like to see some? And I was a bit aghast, and what do you mean? He said, well, I found some just this morning. So off we went. It was a remarkable example of footprints, just as fresh as they could be, and literally had to have been just hours old. It was stunning. We were able to kind of recreate what must have happened, how this creature had come from one direction and apparently was confronted by a vehicle coming down the road because it made a hairpin turn, literally pivoted on one foot, and off it went back in the opposite direction towards the cover of brush. Its stride lengthened, its footprints were deeper, and all the signs of animation that you would expect in a living trackway. These were the footprints of a real creature, a real species.
I asked Professor Meldrum what the significance of that mid-tarsal break was, and what it would mean for how such a creature would move.
There's a little bit of decoupling of the forefoot and hindfoot at the mid-tarsal joint. This is a primitive trait that was first described in non-human hominoids such as chimpanzees, and they're able to locomote right up a steeply inclined tree trunk or branch very readily using that grasping foot. Well, the mid-tarsal break in the Sasquatch foot indicates a retention of that mobility. But in the absence of a divergent big toe, an animal of that size and weight has no business being up in a tree. They're pretty much restricted to the ground. But negotiating steep inclines is facilitated in part by retaining this flexibility between the forefoot and the hindfoot.
It was clear that Professor Meldrum had amassed what he felt was significant evidence during his many years of study. But I was still on the fence. I felt I needed to hear from more people who'd had convincing first-hand encounters with the actual creature. Then, through a friend of mine, I learned of an ex-army guy up in Bozeman, Montana, with just such an encounter to relate. It was an account that really made me question my scepticism. Not only had the man been a US Army Ranger, he had been with 4 of his fellow soldiers, who all experienced the same thing.
At dead of night, when there's nothing else out there in woods, you can hear objects a long distance away. So we estimated at about 100 yards at first, and we could hear it coming toward us. We thought maybe a bear, maybe an elk. So as it got closer, we could hear it taking 2 definite steps, and it got within 25 yards of us. We heard it taking these deep breaths like this. We were scared. If you say you weren't scared, I think you're lying.
Hear the details of that encounter in Myth Seeker Bigfoot, Part 3.